We're meeting today at a time when both Israel and Lebanon are being put at risk by the actions of Hezbollah. Israeli and Lebanese experts alike have warned that tensions are rising across their shared border. With Hezbollah increasing its arsenal of rockets and missiles, some estimates say it's now 10 times what it was in 2006. We're going to ask about the implications for the future and for the safety of the Lebanese people and the Israeli people. Are Israel's recent movements, including the deployment of a third Iron Dome missile defense system on the northern front, a signal of imminent activity? What do others in the region, not least Iran, stand to gain from fueling this conflict? Again, I'm delighted to welcome our panelists to discuss the potential for conflict on the Lebanese-Israeli border. Michael Herzog is a retired brigadier general in the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, and he's the Milton Fine International Fellow of the Washington Institute. Over the last decade, General Herzog has held senior positions in the Office of Israel's Minister of Defense. Tony Bedran is a research fellow at FDD. Born and raised in Lebanon, Tony brings the perspectives of both an insider and a scholar. Hussein Abdul Hussein is the Washington bureau chief of Kuwaiti newspaper Al Rai. Prior to his current job, he worked for Al Hurra as news producer and as a reporter, and later as editor for Beirut's The Daily Star. He published A Quest for Democracy in a World of Realism, the cases of Lebanon and Iran in 2009, and Hezbollah, the State Within a State in 2008 from the Hudson Institute. He has contributed articles to the New York Times, the Washington Post. He's appeared on MSNBC, CNN, and the BBC, and he runs News from Washington and its sister site in Arabic. I'm going to start this conversation by asking a few questions, which I hope will encourage a proactive discussion among Michael, Tony, and Hussein. I'll then ask you to pose questions and join in the conversation. Let me get started with you, Hussein, if I may, and basically start with this pretty simple question. Is a war with Israel in Hezbollah's interest?
For the time being, I don't think it's in Hezbollah's interest. The first thing that comes to mind is that from a logistics perspective, Hezbollah is very thinly stretched. Its resources are strained, and it's sending fighters into Syria to give Assad a hand. So I wouldn't think that Nasrallah would want to see another front on his southern flank. But what I'd like to say also is that things have changed since 2006, and the war between Israel and Hezbollah in July of 2006 and August was really a game changer, at least for the base, the Shia base of Hezbollah. And between 2006 and 2011, things really changed. Hezbollah was being transformed from being an organization that's strictly anti-Israel to an organization that's anti-Sunni. And this phase comes before the big confrontation that we see now between the Sunnis and the Shia of the region. The confrontation between Hezbollah as a Shia organization and the Sunnis of Lebanon preceded this big conflict that we see today. It started 14 weeks after the end of the 2006 war. Of course, the Hezbollah base was severely wounded. The Hezbollah areas were pounded, and villages were flattened, and the Hezbollah was looking for a scapegoat. Of course, its supporters were angry, and they didn't see any good reason why they had to fight that war. They were looking for a scapegoat. And even though during the war Hezbollah was praising the Sunnis and the government of Fuad Sanyura for what he called the resistance cabinet for shaping 1701, which ended the war. Despite the praise, after the war, Hezbollah tried first of all to use the bags of cash that it received from Iran to buy the quiet of its supporters, but that did not succeed. So they had to come up with another tactic, and this was mainly to find a scapegoat, and they found that in the Sunnis of Lebanon. And of course, whenever you're trying to attack the Sunnis from a Shia perspective, that always resonates with all kinds of historic Shia lines. So starting December of 2006, Hezbollah started a sit-in demanding the resignation of Fuad Sinura. Of course, they accused him of not delivering in terms of relief and reconstruction efforts. This period, to my mind, was the first phase of transformation for Hezbollah from a purely anti-Israel to anti-Israel and anti-Sunni. It came before the grand confrontation that we see today. And at the time, this provoked anti-Sunni feeling inside Lebanon only. Hezbollah was still liked throughout most of the region. The Syrians, the Sunnis in Syria were still supportive of Hezbollah between 2006 and 2011. Hezbollah, during this period, they used these domestic politics tactics to absorb the anger of the Shia. And I have to say, by and large, they succeeded. And of course, this was before the outbreak of the Syrian revolution, which was another game changer that changed everything.
Mm-hmm. Tony, what's your sense of the state of the population inside of Lebanon? Are the Shia at this point fearful of a war with Israel? Are the Sunnis angry at Hezbollah because they are bringing war closer and maybe at Iran's bidding? We'll get to that. The Christian population, the Jewish population. How do you see things inside Lebanon at this point in regard to the confrontation with Israel?
First, with regard to the Shia, Hussein can probably complement this as well, but from the anecdotal evidence that we're getting, whenever there's a threat, whenever Nasrallah makes a speech, and that's in the period between 2006 and 2010 specifically, or 2011, we saw an uptick in applications for passports for a lot of the Shia. I mean, Lebanese more generally, but the Shia as well, for people who just wanted to leave. I mean, even by 2008, 2010, a lot of the reconstruction, despite the money that Hussein talked about from Iran, had not been actually completed. So people still had houses that were destroyed, and despite all the cash, they weren't able to do it. And so they their livelihoods, the economy in the south got really massacred. Then you get also the new phenomenon that we're seeing as well which is antidepressants, drugs, culture that is booming. And ironically, it's actually, Hezbollah members who are part of the distributing network in there. The siblings of Hezbollah officials who are actually in charge of bringing the drugs in. So this is kind of on the Shia. On the Sunni side, it's not so much anger about Hezbollah bringing war to Lebanon from Israel, so much as it is a purely sectarian sentiment following which was prodded primarily after the 2008 attack on the Sunni neighborhoods in West Beirut, killing among not just armed men, but also civilians and unarmed people, which sort of brought that peak and that tension, which was deliberate on the part of Hezbollah for a long time, to its height. Now with the war in Syria, this has gone to unspeakable levels, right? This is the defining sentiment now. This is the defining schism between in Lebanon between the Sunni and Shia. Now, they're fighting it out in Syria, not so much in Lebanon. Although within Lebanon, if Hezbollah has felt the need to attack certain Sunni villages or strongholds that are seen to be logistical hubs for support of the revolution in Syria, it has done so, but it has done so indirectly by using its assets within the Lebanese armed forces and security apparatuses, so that it would look as though the state is handling this business, not Hezbollah itself, even though it's on Hezbollah's behalf very much. With the Druze, it's an interesting situation because they're probably geographically the most affected in all of this, because the Druze areas in the Shuf Mountains and in the western Bekaa are, unfortunately for them, right smack in the middle of preventing the territorial contiguity of the Shia areas. that are concentrated on the one hand in the northeast and in the south. So if you want to pass, if you want to link up these areas, you have to go through a lot of the Shuf mountains, which also overlook Beirut and Hezbollah strongholds in Beirut. So they are logistically of great importance. Now Hezbollah rings these areas and has people positioned there, and there has been skirmishes whereby they would come in with their cars and come too close, and then they would get a beating from the Druze fighters, and then they would back off. But there's a lot of simmering tension, and the idea was, especially after 2006, that in the next conflict, the Hezbollah fighters are going to move into the Druze areas for logistical purposes, which would then bring Israeli retaliation on the Druze areas, which would then heighten tensions even more, maybe lead to internal conflict. So as far as the Druze leadership is concerned, they feel it much more than the Sunnis when it comes to feeling the wrath of an Israeli retaliation as a result of Hezbollah action, more so than the Sunnis, who are probably, they do live in the south as well, so they will be affected, but the source of the tension is more sectarian than it is related to Israel or an Israeli retaliation.
Several things there I want to come back to in Syria, but let me go to General Herzog first. A few years ago, you had missiles in Lebanon, mostly confined to the south. Now they're spread throughout the entire country, 60,000, 70,000, I've heard different estimates. Does there come a point at which Israel says we cannot have that many missiles pointing at us and we have to do something about it?
No, I don't see Israel taking a preemptive strike just because Hezbollah is arming itself, but this poses a serious challenge to Israel. Should Israel feel compelled to confront Hezbollah in the future? Now, I agree with Hussein that Hezbollah is not interested, and Israel is also not interested. Israel is faced today with a lot of uncertainty and unstable environment, given the Arab Spring, civil war in Syria, events in Egypt. There's still the issue of Iran, a big issue looming over the horizon. I don't think Israel has an interest in confrontation with Hezbollah in Lebanon at this point. However, things could escalate, not in immediate bilateral Israeli-Lebanese context, but due to other issues. The first is Syria. The fact is that in Syria there's a huge stockpile of weapons. Everybody is talking about the chemical weapons, but there is a huge conventional strategic stockpile of weapons which people ignore. Tens of thousands of missiles and rockets, Scud missiles, anti-air missiles, anti-ship missiles, and so on. Hezbollah eyes these weapons, and Israel already, as reported by the press, took action once against the convoy, may take action once again and again, and if that repeats itself, then things could escalate. The second context where I can see things escalating, even though basically both parties are not interested, is Iran. If either Israel or the United States decide to strike Iran, I believe that Hezbollah will act against Israel. It is true that Hezbollah has a full plate. It is preoccupied with Syria. It has forces there. Hezbollah combatants are dying in Syria. There are domestic constraints in Lebanon. I think they know they will pay a heavy price if they are perceived by the people of having ignited another war in Lebanon. But that said, I believe that the fact that Hezbollah has 60,000 to 70,000 rockets is because the Iranians armed them exactly towards this day when either Israel or the US will strike Iran, and they will activate them. And since Nasrallah upholds the principle of Wilayat al-Faqih, that he obeys the spiritual leader of Iran, if he's told to do so, he will do so. Because of his constraints, he may not employ the full capacity that he has, but I believe, I don't see a scenario where Hezbollah doesn't do anything. The third context is, as we all know, Hezbollah has been part of a shadow war over the last few years. The numerous incidents where they try to take action against Israeli targets abroad. For one thing, is trying to revenge the death of Imad Mounia, which they blamed Israel for another, as part of a shadow war between Iran and Israel. There are over 20 cases of attempts by Hezbollah abroad to carry out terror attacks against Israeli targets. Most of them failed. One of them in Bulgaria last year succeeded. There's a case now in Cyprus which was exposed, and that could also at a certain point get out of hand if they continue in doing so. So the bottom line is that while both parties are certainly not interested in another confrontation, another round, there are sufficient reasons to bring about escalation, maybe not in the immediate future, but this could certainly happen.
You see, picking up what the general was just saying, the idea that Nasrallah and Hezbollah feel a loyalty to Iran and to the supreme leader. If the supreme leader says to Nasrallah, you need to attack Israel, is there any possibility of refusing that? Is there, or does that become something that just has to be obeyed?
Well, I'd say he'll have to try to reason with the Supreme Guide, even though that's almost impossible all the time. But you know, the Shia and Hezbollah, they follow the Supreme Guide in Iran for many reasons. And one of these reasons is that this man is supposed to be the leader of the world of Shia that they belong to. Now, at other instances, this man might want to start a fight with Israel, but that's, you know, the link is not is not there. And what I'll try to argue is that Hezbollah has been the whole literature within Hezbollah has been shifting from being about Palestine to being about Shia versus Sunni. Now look at the force that they formed inside Syria, and they called it Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas Brigade. And Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas is the half-brother of Imam Hussein, who was killed in 680. So even though Nasrallah claims that he's giving Assad a hand because Assad is part of the resistance axis, they go and call their fighting force something that's anti-Sunni, that's not anti-Israel. They could have called it Abbas al-Musawi or Imad Mughniya or whatnot. Now another thing, there's a common feeling in within the Shia community, especially in Lebanon. Palestine is not Shia. It has never been Shia. It has always been Sunni. And of the countries in the Levant, if you look at Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and even Iran, you will find that there are Shia landmarks, Shia shrines, Shia history. Now, Palestine does not have any Shia shrines, any Shia imams buried there. There are no families who ever lived in that part of the region. And also, even the most important Islamic landmark in Jerusalem is called Masjid Omar. And Omar is a name that the Shia hate, and they don't even give to their children. So all these things factor in when the Shia think about whether they plan to pick up a fight or to start a fight with Israel for just, you know, liberating Jerusalem or not. The whole Palestine and liberation of Jerusalem, even talking about Shia, is not in the statements of Hezbollah anymore. Everything is taking a back seat, and what's becoming very important now is how to give the Sunnis a beating, especially inside Syria.
And just, I'm going to go to you, Tony, but just so I understand, do you feel that what's going on in Syria, that conflict, is really heightening tensions, heightening the differences between Sunni and Shia, not least among the more radical segments? We know that for a long time there has been cooperation between the regime in Iran and al-Qaeda. one wonders if that's breaking down because they are literally fighting each other on the front lines in Syria at this point, Al-Qaeda and both IRGC and Al-Quds and Hezbollah and their clients.
Well, it used to be that Assad would try to launch these fake or pretend jihadi movements and send them into Lebanon. And this was useful for Bashar Assad because it would justify his using of brutal force against these groups, and then he'd come to Western countries and try to sell this effort as being a partner in the war against terror. At this point, Hezbollah is really frightened of the jihadis. There's a divergence with how Assad views these things. Assad needs the jihadis to justify his brutality. Hezbollah is scared of the jihadis. This past week there has been news that Hezbollah detonated a bomb that Jabhat al-Nusra was trying to plant in Hayy al-Sulam in the southern suburb of Beirut. So the tension is high. But Hezbollah are doing their best, and like Tony just said, they're doing their best to keep the fight between the Shias and the Sunnis inside Syria. It's not in their interest to have fights both in Lebanon and inside Syria at the same time. Let me make just one more point. According to the breakdown of the numbers, we estimate the fighters of Hezbollah to be around 7,000 to 15,000 fighters. Now, all the numbers we've seen from Syria, this past week there has been an article in the Post by David Ignatius when he was breaking in the numbers, and you'd see that, for example, the Jabhat al-Tahrir Syria, that's pro-Saudi, has 37,000 fighters. The small one, the small Salafi group, has 15,000. Assad is estimated to have 70,000, according to Joseph Holliday from the Institute of the Study of War, and so on and so forth. So Hezbollah has a strong force, well-trained, well-armed, but it's not good for a long war of attrition with big numbers in Syria.
Okay, you can tell you have some.
Well, I mean, just when it comes to the idea, your initial question as to whether, if the Iranians say you should do it, would we do it? One thing two points. First of all, looking at Iranian statements over the past couple of years, including by very high-ranking advisors to Khamenei and former commander of the IRGC, Safavi, for instance. He made a very open public statement that, look, if we get hit by the Israelis won't dare to hit, or if we do get hit, we will not need to retaliate against Israel because our partners in Hezbollah will be raining rockets on it. So he spoke on behalf of Hezbollah and delineated exactly what the course of action would be in that case. Now, whether, I mean, you can argue that it's propaganda or that it may not necessarily be followed. I mean, but it's there, and you have to take it into consideration. I mean, I tend to believe that's more as an order of operation than anything else. But beyond that, we have to also factor in another thing that happened after 2006, especially by 2009, 2010, which is the increase in visibility of Quds Force commanders on the ground in Beirut in terms of command and control over Hezbollah operations, from their financial dealings to the strategic missiles and systems that they were procuring, and the rehabilitation of their entire infrastructure. I mean, so recently, you know that this Quds Force commander was killed in Syria, Hassan Shateri. Now, he's not the only one, and he's not the Quds commander head in Beirut. That's another guy who's still in Beirut. But this guy was involved in their telecommunication network, in their military engineering, and may have been in Syria to oversee the transfer of some of the strategic weapons from Syria following the Israeli strike on the convoy. So the combination of Quds Force command and control and obviously the obvious ideological issue of their fealty to Khamenei. I mean, they list in their literature, for instance, that they went into political action in Lebanon only after Khamenei gave the permission for them to do so. So these kinds of things, I tend to believe that will probably, it will make it very uncomfortable for Nasrallah, because he will be facing a very destitute Shia base in Lebanon. But then again, the question is whether he answers to the Shia base or whether he answers to Khamenei. And I believe that ultimately he answers to Khamenei. But he will try to negotiate, as Hussein said, but ultimately I think what will trump it is the fact that Hezbollah is effectively an arm of the Quds force.
And so when Nasrallah sits down with the Quds commander in Beirut, is the Quds commander the boss?
I mean, look, I obviously I have no insight into the inner workings of Hezbollah's command, but judging from the reports that have emerged about, especially the financial operations of Hezbollah in Beirut, and where the Quds Force commander, Mahdavi in Beirut, how he has sort of played a very direct role in running the financial operations of this group, and the fact that actually their envoy, as it were, in Tehran is effectively the CFO of the organization. I mean, their global, especially the drug trade, the money laundering operation, the guy is based in Tehran too. And he's what is he, nephew of Hassan Nasrallah, I think, or cousin. I'm sorry, he's the cousin of Hassan Safiuddin. He's the cousin of Hassan Nasrallah, and he's based in Tehran, right under the Iranians' thumb. So I tend to believe that because of all of that the ability of Hezbollah to have a margin of maneuver, should an order come down that you have to do this, is going to be very, very limited.
I'm going to ask a few more questions, but feel free to come up to a mic if you have questions to ask as well. General Herzog, the Israeli view had been, in terms of Syria, that the devil you know, Bashar al-Assad, is not better, preferable to the devil you don't know, that it's time for him to fall, you'd like to see him fall. I wonder if there's been any reflection on that, any second thoughts on that, given the fact that the most potent force in the opposition to Assad at this point is not just al-Qaeda affiliated, but from what we're hearing, is essentially a full-blown branch of al-Qaeda.
Well, the perspective from Israel is that there are no good options in Syria. All options are bad. And that nearly 40 years of quiet along our border with Syria are about to end, given the fact that jihadis are taking over the border area, and we can see them. I went to the Golan Heights, I could see those guys, you can see fighting, you can just see them. Now, it is true that at some point Israel decided that it's better off without Assad, given the fact that he was a linchpin of this radical axis combining Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah. And the idea is that if he goes, this will deal a severe blow not only to Iran, but to the whole axis. No matter who takes over, assuming it's not another Alawite strongman. And that will be a severe blow to the whole axis. But then, who takes over, this is a big question, and of course Israelis feel very uneasy about Islamists or jihadis playing a dominant role in Syria. My own take is that the more likely scenario is that Syria will kind of disintegrate, not in a formal way, but in a de facto way along sectarian lines. And what we see along close to our border is not very encouraging. So, as I said, there are no good options. In any way, Israel doesn't want to play a role there and has little influence, if any, on events in Syria. The major Israeli focus right now is not on the political scene, but rather to make sure that the huge stockpiles, either chemical or conventional strategic does not fall into the wrong hands, either of jihadis or Hezbollah in Lebanon. I think this is the number one focus of Israelis along the situation on the border, to make sure that we will not provoke them I believe it's only a matter of time until some of those jihadi groups will target Israel. They are saying it openly. Once they get rid of Assad, the next target is Israel. Israel is building a border fence now along that border, enhancing the deployment of forces. The whole situation is very, very volatile and fragile.
The al-Nusra Front is seen as very adept combatants in the Syrian context. If Israel has to take them on, do they seem to be a challenge, or is it something that the Israelis will be able to?
I don't regard them as a military challenge, but you know, when you are faced with non-state actors in a very atomized way, it's a challenge of its own. We're not going to, yes, the risk of having to fight a war with a regular army is diminished in Syria, but there are many non-state actors now threatening Israel. We have to, first of all, to know who they are. These are new actors. Israel doesn't know all of them. You have to develop your knowledge, gather intelligence, which is what Israel is doing right now. But as I said, many of them are newcomers to the scene, and it takes time to learn and gather intelligence and develop operational plans.
One more question. Israel doesn't quite admit this, but there have been convoys that have been trying to apparently get from Syria into Lebanon that have been destroyed. The presumption is that this is by the Israelis. Are those convoys, as best as you understand, Hezbollah convoys, or are they Alawite convoys, or who is doing this, and if the Israelis are hitting these convoys, who are they hitting?
There was one case in late February where reportedly Israeli Air Force attacked a convoy in Syria destined for Hezbollah in Lebanon, carrying strategic weapons, according to reports, anti-air missiles, SA-17, which is a very sophisticated missile, and the assumption is that had this weapon system arrived in Lebanon, it would tip the balance against Israel. Now, from my understanding, this huge stockpile is still controlled by the Syrian military, and they allowed Hezbollah to take part of it and move it to Lebanon, which I think speaks a lot for itself. It is not, and it was meant to reach Hezbollah hands in Lebanon. The question still is, what's going to happen to this huge stockpiles? The whole world is focused on the chemical weapons, and for good reason. But there is a huge conventional strategic stockpile in Syria, and the question is what's going to happen to this stockpile once the regime collapses. And Israel is focused on that question no less than on the chemical one. I believe that if actionable intelligence presents itself to Israel, it will act again. Because I think, as Israeli leaders made clear, we don't want to be facing a situation where the strategic balance in Lebanon is tipped against Israel, and if in the future Israel has to confront Hezbollah, it doesn't want to confront it under rare circumstances. So the tension is there, and it could happen again.
I know it's very hard to make predictions, but do you have a sense of what is likely in Syria? Is Assad going to fall in any time frame? And after he does, what happens? My guess is that it's not peace and prosperity after his falls. It could be a conflict continuing and simmering for a long time. We haven't mentioned the Kurds. My guess is the Kurds have substantial autonomy right now and aren't going to give that up very easily. And if the Kurds don't give up their autonomy, plenty of other people, other groups are also going to try to hold on to their territory and their choices.
My guess is that it'll take a longer time because, as it stands, the rebels don't have what it takes to crack Assad's nut, to just beat the west and the north of Damascus and force him to retreat all the way through Homs and then all the way to his Alawi enclave. At this point, they still can't do it, which means this will continue as war of attrition. But what we know is that no matter when Assad falls, we'll be dealing with a mess in Syria. And what happened is that, and this is probably a wrong assessment on our part. It was wrong in Iraq, and now, because we always tend to think that if someone like Saddam Hussein or Bashar Assad is in charge, that underneath him there's a group of institutions that's functioning. Well, that's not true. The only institution that's functioning is the intelligence, the mukhabarat. And these are brutal, and they keep everyone in line. Everything else, including the army, which we blame ourselves all the time for disbanding in Iraq. I don't think, even if we kept the army, I don't think it would have been functional enough to do any significant job that we wanted it to do. And I think the same will be in Syria. So what we're facing now is that this has been stripped down to the bare bones of Syria. Everyone is fighting for themselves, its tribes, its clans, its Sunnis, Shias, Kurds. And you have to think within the Sunnis, because today in the Post, Lislai was reporting on how within the rebels, rank and file, the FSA, they're fighting the Islamists versus the more secular ones. So I think it's complicated, and it's a mess, and we already missed the times when we could influence this and have a better outcome. So as
you think we could, or you think that if we had supported the more secular or the more liberal elements in the FSA and earlier on, al-Nusra Front and those groups would not have gotten the kind of foothold they have now?
Yes, I do. I think, at a certain point, if we had, supported these guys, maybe applied more pressure, not only, when I say pressure, it's not only on Russia and China. Now, look at the Syrian opposition, and you'll see that each faction of these opposition forces is connected to either Qatar or Saudi Arabia or Turkey, or and the United States could have really brought all these together, did maybe some arm twisting, and made sure that they are unified instead of having all these factions going after each other more than fighting Assad sometimes.
Maybe picking up on that, the U.S. outsourced a lot of its Syria policy to the Turks, to the Qataris, to the Saudis, who seem to have supported Islamists of one stripe or another from Muslim Brotherhood. Was that a big mistake, and is it correctable?
I mean, when we say outsourced, it kind of implies a deliberate strategy, where I think it doesn't even rise to that level. I don't think we actually intentionally said to the Turks, okay, here you go, you guys handle this, and good luck, we're here for you. It's just that the U.S. was just completely out of the picture. I mean, these guys were begging the United States. They were begging the United States to come in and take charge. The Turks came to Washington. They told in March of last year, or the year before, I can't remember when, no, March of last year, and they begged, the foreign minister begged the Secretary of State Clinton at the time, please, we want to know what you're going to do. Are you willing to take these kinds of measures, blah, blah, blah. And Secretary Clinton said, nope, we're not there, we're not going to be there. And so they were effectively left on their own. They weren't given a task, because if the United States had at least managed it in that way, because only the United States could manage the various agendas of all these actors. Instead, now what we have is a situation where they're all left to fend for themselves. So, and I wrote about this at the time, that now you have a bunch of de facto buffer zones in Syria. The Turks have their little buffer zone. Obviously, on the one hand, they can't really go into the Kurdish area, so they are sponsoring, have good contacts with groups that operate in the Idlib and Aleppo countrysides. Sometimes they will help them go into the Kurdish areas to beat up on the Kurds a little bit, but they'll give them logistical support to come through Turkey or be hospitalized in Turkey and so on. That's on the one side. The Jordanians are doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. They're building their ties with a number of groups in the Hawran Dara region, which, by the way, go also by clan and tribal links that also extend into Jordan. And they're quite effective, you know, and the leadership of those groups are, I mean, one of them, a colonel, defected colonel from the Syrian army, is now based in Jordan. He facilitated the defection of the former prime minister, who is also from Daraa, who is now in Jordan. And so they will create their little network there. I suspect, I mean, the Israelis were talking about a buffer zone without going into Syria, so just to enforce it either kinetically, to go in and out, or through air force or whatever. And I suspect that if they feel tactically that they have to do that to protect security near the Golan Heights, they will probably do it. I mean, the strike in Damascus showed that they're looking at the situation very closely, and that if the intelligence and the opportunity arises where they feel they have to do it, they will do it. And they are building intelligence, as General Herzog said. You know, there are a lot of people who are talking to them, and they're talking to a lot of people. They have not just Druze, incidentally, Sunnis as well, and so they will try to do that. And everybody's just going to try to cordon off this mess in Syria, because nobody has the influence to actually fix it. So they will just try to take a security approach towards it. And so what's interesting about all of this is that it makes it politically less costly now to strike in Syria. I mean, it's much more costly to strike in Lebanon, which is a bizarre reversal of roles between Syria and Lebanon. In the past, Israel would strike more liberally in Lebanon and kind of stay away from striking in Syria unless it was really an intended strike and so on. Now, they would, if they have to, they will strike in Lebanon, to be sure, but for the most part, the situation in Syria is politically cost-free now, that they can come in and they can hit, much more so than the Sinai, for instance, where there was fear also of this kind of lawlessness taking place. So if that's approach by all of these guys, Jordanians, Turks, and Israelis, and Hezbollah, incidentally, is doing the same thing on its own border with Syria, carving out its little buffer zone where it's operating near Baalbek and the Hermel up in the north. And that's basically how we're going to see Syria for quite a while, I think.
If Syria is in this situation and is deteriorating and deteriorates, does it make it much harder or not so much harder for Iran to continue to supply Hezbollah, or does Hezbollah become weakened if Syria is a deteriorated or a failed state?
Look, there's no doubt that they will take a hit. I mean, there's a reason why they are so adamant about defending it, and where they're putting so many resources to defend the region. This is an important historical strategic ally of theirs. The longest alliance in the Middle East, incidentally, and longest lasting alliance. So they're not going to give up on that easily. Now, I mean, I've speculated, others speculated that along the lines that we're talking about, these kind of buffer zones and the de facto disintegration of Syria into localized cantons for all these warring groups. If they can't, and I suspect that by now they realize that they can't really take charge of the entire country anymore, they will at least try to preserve that little corner along the Mediterranean coast with a corridor that links it into Homs and then sort of near the border with Lebanon, where Hezbollah is deployed now. That at least will continue to have access to the Mediterranean, to the ports of the Mediterranean, so they can bring stuff in that way. Although the Beirut port is openly controlled by Hezbollah as well, as is Beirut airport, so they can. It's harder. It's much harder, much costlier to do it this way than it was to bring them overland from Syria. But part of the problem that we're seeing now is that a lot of the stockpiles that General Herzog were talking about, it's not just Syrian regime stockpiles. These were actually stockpiles that were bought by the Iranians. The Syrians procured them. It's a triangle, either from North Korea or from Russia, mainly Russia. But these were systems that were procured by the Syrians on behalf of Hezbollah and paid for by the Iranians. And they were stashed in weapons depots inside Syria, precisely because of that previous equation that existed in the past, whereby Israel would not strike inside Syria. So unless these things were moved into Lebanon, that's when they would be struck. But now that the security of maintaining these depots is in question, they feel the need that they have to start bringing some of that stuff in, including these advanced systems, which will be a possible trigger for more escalation if they bring it into Lebanon.
Mm-hmm. Again, if you have questions, come up to the microphone. Is there any configuration you can imagine in Syria post-Assad that the Israelis would find absolutely impossible to tolerate? In other words, an Alawistan, as Tony has said, where Assad goes and he protects himself, and he has Tartus, and he has a port that he gets. Is there anything where the Israelis to say, that's not acceptable to us?
Well, I can see many outcomes that Israelis will not like, but I don't think they can do much about it. The only thing they will do much about is when the security is directly threatened, either in the border area by jihadi groups provoking Israel, or when part of this strategic stockpile falls into the wrong hand, and Israel intervenes in order to stop that. I agree with my co-panelists. I think it's the more time goes by, it's becoming more and more of a mess, impossible to fix. I believe that it is more likely that war will continue to consume Syria even after Assad falls. Nobody knows when that's going to happen, but we will continue to consume Syria more and more along sectarian lines. I don't see a diplomatic resolution in the offing right now. It's going to be a mess and a failed state for a long time, probably years, I believe.
That segues into my question. I'm Dan Pollak from the Zionist Organization of America, and for each of you, the United States and Israel both have to profess that we want to see this humanitarian nightmare come to an end, but from a purely interest point of view, doesn't it serve American and Israeli national interests for there to be a continued period of instability in Syria rather than any kind of consolidation of power there? So the likely outcome of long-term instability isn't really so bad for American interests.
Tony, you want to start on that, or
Sure.
try?
Look, on the face of it, it's an attractive proposal, but once you actually start picking at it, I don't think it becomes that tenable of a position. The primary objective in Syria for the United States was, and remains, right, that to, and as far as Israel is concerned as well, is to cut that node in the axis, the Iranian axis that links Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon. This is the way that Iran was able to project influence in the Eastern Mediterranean, to establish a front on the border with Israel. Let's not forget what they were doing in Syria as well. I mentioned the stockpiling of these weapons. They were procuring these weapons, but they're also like establishing listening posts, command inside Damascus for the IRGC, and so on and so forth. So it was really an advanced base for them. None of the other groups that we're talking about in Syria, I mean, as of yet at least, possess the type of strategic capabilities that this axis had and the type of strategic threat that this axis had. So and on the level of prioritizing the threat, this remains the priority. The problem is that if you're letting the situation play out whereby you're not actually toppling this threat, and which means toppling the Assad regime, but you kind of let it survive in reduced form, and okay, maybe it may be diminished in terms of what it could do, but it could still serve Iranian purposes much, I mean, maybe in a slightly reduced fashion, but essentially the same way, to procure weapons to Hezbollah, to be able to act as some sort of strategic depth for Hezbollah as well. But then add to that another problem of just complete disintegration of Syria and the introduction of other groups that, while now may not pose a strategic threat, may come to possess the type of weaponry that could become a strategic threat. Then you've just added another problem on top of an existing problem. You haven't really taken care of the problem. So the idea that they will be fighting each other for a while, that somehow this will be good for U.S. interest, I'm not sure if any of our allies in the region shares that reading, as they have to face the security consequences of what that type of situation would mean for them, and for the overall balance of power in the region, which is everybody, I mean, the Saudis, but all the Sunni actors specifically, are looking at the United States and saying, okay, we don't understand, help us out. You have an opportunity to deal a very huge blow, strategic blow to the Iranians, and tip the balance in the region from them to your allies. The fact, I mean, we may not like the Saudis, we may not like the Qataris, right? But or the Erdogan government, but they are U.S. allies. And that's the bottom line. Half of them are dependent states on the United States, and you're not taking the opportunity. So we don't understand that. That's the view there, much more than, oh, that's good, let these guys fight it out, and we'll live with a security nightmare that ensues.
Actually, let me just
Sure.
say a word on this, and you guys can agree with me or disagree. There's certainly a certain amount of schadenfreude
Right.
at seeing the Iranians and Al-Qaeda fighting it out.
Right.
On the other hand, if it came to the point where an Al-Qaeda affiliate or Al-Qaeda group controlled a substantial amount of land in Syria, I don't see how the Obama administration or any administration can say, it's not our problem. It becomes a problem. I mean, the West cannot have Al-Qaeda controlling Mali. How can they have Al-Qaeda controlling large sections of Syria? So that, once you get over ha-ha-ha, isn't this wonderful to see our enemies fighting our enemies, then you have to say, and what's our next step?
Right.
And you kind of have to have one.
Right.
Because, again, you can't leave a big portion of that country in Al-Qaeda hands over a long weekend.
Or worse still, part of it in Al-Qaeda hands and the other part in IRGC hands.
Right, exactly. So there are those, you're right that there are those who are thinking that, but I think they're not thinking particularly very strategically, and maybe short run, but long run, that's not it seems to me an untenable situation from a U.S. Policy point of view.
Yeah, let me just add that with Bashar al-Assad, with the Assad regime, it looked like stability more than anything else. I mean, granted, we could have our Speaker of the House go and be given a drive around Damascus in the presidential car, but that was
magazine.
Yeah, of course. that was pretty much it, because if you heard yesterday, there was this sort of merger. I don't know what it means, but there's merger between the Al-Qaeda of Iraq and that of Syria. And those folks, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and the whole Qaeda of Iraq, was set up in great part, under sponsorship of Assad. So even though he was hosting our speaker, at the same time he was, helping to kill our troops in Iraq. So he looked stable. But like Tony said, missiles,
Nuclear program.
nuclear, chemical, you name it. I mean, he was doing everything. So we had to deal with this sooner or later. And unfortunately, over the past 40 years, there was this template in which, there were the ups and downs of Assad. We get angry at him, we pull out the ambassador, no one talks to him, and then, he stays in the cold out for a few years, and then he comes back after the administration changes, and so on and so forth. And he was a huge source of destabilization for the region, even though he looked nice.
George Berry, Lebanese Information Center. I want to ask Hussein and Tony about your assessment about Hezbollah's political situation now and their choices. I mean, they just lost a government they control, and the new government may not be to their liking. You mentioned also their relationship with the various communities, the Sunni, the Druze, the Christians. Obviously, they cannot rely on Aoun as they used to be. So their future looks bleak. What do you expect them to do at this point? Do you expect them to negotiate? Do you expect them to be maybe more violent, paranoid, maybe at that point even go ahead and attack Israel just to shift the focus? What are your thoughts on this?
My thinking is that even though Hezbollah is not a democratic organization, but it behaves in a way that's a bit different than the autocrats, your average autocrat, whether in Iran or in Syria. And most of the time it responds to how the Shia mood goes inside Lebanon. And what's going on now is part of it. Now, of course, you remember when Bashar al-Assad wanted to force the extension of the mandate of Emir Lahoud, even though all of his allies counseled to the contrary. But he insists because at times in the Middle East, this is how politics goes. It's not all or none. So it's a battle of wills. Hezbollah does not operate this way, and it tries to use its force, especially domestically inside Lebanon, very sparingly. And I think what Hezbollah cares for, and they probably said this publicly so many times, they even told Hariri, you do reconstruction and whatever kind of governing, we'll take care of security and foreign policy. And I think that's what makes Hezbollah, look lenient on domestic issues. Now, what I think is more important than letting go of Najib Miati and the selection of Tamam Salam, what I think is more important is that Hezbollah made sure that it controls the whole of Lebanon with the killing of Wissam al-Hassan, and this was less than 6 months ago. And Wissam al-Hassan was becoming the head of a very competent intelligence operation, very well trained and funded and sort of independent, and a strong muscle for the Sunnis in Lebanon. And when they got rid of him, they made sure that they're undisputed in terms of security. That's what Hezbollah cares about. But when it comes to government and other sorts of things, I think he can step back and they'll be fine.
Yeah, I think it just goes, I agree. I mean, I think it just goes to underscore actually how, despite, especially since the 90s, once they started doing parliamentary politics, everybody understood that this was representative of a shift, that they are now becoming a political movement. The fact of the matter is that they actually have rather a contemptuous view of politics. And I think they really care about their military enterprise, and therefore controlling the security apparatuses of the state to eliminate any potential threat within it. And Wissam al-Hassan, you're exactly right. I mean, Wissam al-Hassan was viewed as a Saudi and U.S. asset within the heart of the intelligence services in Lebanon. And they took him out. And then after that, they kind of facilitated the exit of Ashraf Rifi, who's the head of the internal security forces where Wissam al-Hassan was working. And now he's out as well. And then whether the government falls after that or not, it doesn't really matter, because that's not where they get their legitimacy, it's not where they get their power, it's not where they get their money. They're completely independent of all these structures, so they don't really care if it plays out, if it doesn't play out. The point is whether the levels of threat domestically are tolerable, which they are, they can live with it. I mean, everybody keeps hyping the Sunni Salafi threat. I mean, it could maybe down the road, but I have my serious doubts that they view it that way at this point, at least. I mean, these are groups that are very perfectly containable, that they don't really rise to a challenge for Hezbollah domestically in any way, as long as they're capable to keep control over the borders, and if not, they can use their assets within the security apparatuses to strike. Like I said, like the episode of Arsal in the Bekaa, for instance, is a perfect example. I mean, they used assets in the military intelligence, went in, did an assassination inside Arsal and got out, and then cordoned off the area. So this is the kind of thing that I think they care about more. Everything else is trivial.
The Christians of Syria have been reluctant to pick up arms against Assad because they think it could be worse rather than better. How are the Christians of Lebanon looking at this situation?
I mean, like always, they're divided. So that you have one group that is allied with Hezbollah that shares, interestingly, I mean, to pick up on what Hussein was saying, sort of this idea of Hezbollah's redefinition of. It's not really a redefinition, a sort of recapturing of a pre-existent hatred towards Sunnis, but making it a visible part of how they address this issue, how they define themselves as well. On the part of the Michel Aoun movement, the movement allied with Hezbollah, their self-definition is equally a hatred and fear of Sunnis. I mean, that's how this guy, that's what he does. There is no platform beyond that. So they share that sentiment. The Christian, the Maronite Church, the head of the Maronite Church, is parochial in that sense as well. So there are elements in the Christian community that obviously look at Syria and see, oh my God, the Sunnis, and so and that's their reaction. But there are others who aren't. I mean, there are others who are allied with the Sunnis in Lebanon. They understand also that Lebanon's viability economically is utterly dependent on its good relations with the Sunni environment in the Middle East, from Saudi Arabia to the Gulf states, where half of the population works and sends money back as well. And so I think in that sense you find a division, but also these are oftentimes irrational sentiments, right? These are minoritarian fears and irrational sentiments. They're not necessarily, they don't reflect an accurate and sort of cold assessment of what will actually happen to them should the situation change in Syria or not change in Syria. And just lastly, I mean, a lot of these guys forget, this generation of Christians forget that in the 70s and 80s, when bombs were falling on Christian areas in Beirut, they were from Assad's father. Okay, that was flattening their houses over their heads because they were leading the coalition against Syrian interference in Lebanon. So you know how quickly they forget, but that's the fact. Assad basically doesn't care. He's not going to protect you because you're a Christian. I mean, he's protecting his interests, and that was the bottom line.
A couple of times, yeah, go ahead.
You opened the session by talking about the fact that there were about maybe up to 70,000 missiles in Lebanon, Hezbollah missiles in population centers. You want to question for General Herzog in your conversations with the administration, Congress, others. How much of an appreciation do you think there is to the situation on the ground?
I think there is appreciation, there's good realization of what Hezbollah stands for, Hezbollah's arsenal, potential for escalation with Israel. That said, I feel, in talking to people here in the administration, that they kind of don't know exactly what to do about Syria and about Lebanon. I think that U.S. passivity in Syria is eroding U.S. prestige in the region, and that's not good for Israel as well. And talking to people here, I mean, you feel that there's no full grasp of this reality. Many people still believe in a diplomatic solution at this point, which I think is, too late for it right now. But I think people realize that if there is, God forbid, a third Lebanon war between Israel and Hezbollah, it will be very ugly, it will be very messy, it will be different than the one fought in 2006, given the fact that they have 60 to 70,000 rockets and are going to use them not only against the northern part of Israel, but also against the main population centers. I expect that Tel Aviv will be targeted big way. Nasrallah himself said recently that if there is war in Israel, they will target Israeli infrastructure. He said Israel will be in the dark for 6 months because they will not have electricity. So even if he's bragging, I think there is, I can certainly see the logic behind what he's saying, that if there is another war, they will want to exact a high price, but I don't think Israel is going to play exactly that game. So if war erupts, it will be very messy.
One second, let me just follow up on that for 1 second, because in the 2006 war, it was not Israel's intention to destroy Hezbollah. In the most recent war in Gaza, it was not Israel's intention to destroy Hamas. In a future war with Hezbollah, might that change? Might that be a war where the Israelis say we cannot simply go back to our corners and wait for the third war?
Well, the word destroy is a very big word. It implies that you physically go out and destroy their capabilities, and that's a big thing to do. But what I would say is the following: given the fact that they have this arsenal, and given the fact that Israel doesn't have the capabilities at this point to intercept this arsenal of tens of thousands of rockets, the Iron Dome system, which worked perfectly when it came to Gaza and absolved Israel of the need to go into Gaza in the recent conflict in November, is incapable of intercepting the heavier and longer range Hezbollah rockets, and there are thousands of them. and we don't have sufficient numbers at this point to intercept tens of thousands of rockets. So given that, and given Israel's lessons from 2006, where Israel waited for too long, and ultimately launched a ground operation in the last 60 hours, which was too little, too late, I think this time Israel is going to behave differently. Strong airstrikes against Hezbollah targets. I think, unlike 2006, it is likely that Israel will also target national infrastructure which supports Hezbollah's capabilities. In 2006, Israel refrained from doing so. And if there is a ground operation, it will be launched early on. It will be a totally different scenario, I believe. Lessons have been learned, exercise, and the idea in Israel is not to allow a repeat of the 2006 war, where we kind of oscillated between a strong strike and then a quick exit and a ground operation. This time Israel will strike heavily from the start, from the beginning of the war, and we want to end it so that it is clear that Hezbollah was beaten. There's no question mark about this. The feeling in Israel that 2006 war was a miss. We could have done better, and we didn't do good well enough.
I have two questions. First, following up General Herzog's comment, the concern that you raised about the 60,000 missiles that Hezbollah has, and what we heard before, that Nasrallah is really an agent of Iran. Couldn't one really conclude that that is exactly a deterrent force that Iran wants, and that in fact it would act as a deterrent for Israel attacking the nuclear facilities in Iran? Because however much Israel speculates on Iranian intentions, the bottom line is that they will pay a very heavy price if they want, assuming that Hezbollah fires its rockets. My second question follows up on what you commented about the American policy. Would you say that there was any rationale to the United States policy of inaction, or was it more that you hear speculation, it was simply the default before the presidential election, and that's what drove the whole decision?
And let me ask you to use this opportunity to sum up and add any points that you think should be, and we'll pretty much on time. You want to start? Yeah.
Well, it is true that this arsenal was built as a deterrent force against Israel, and I think the fact that the Iranians armed them this way is certainly with a mind to a possible scenario where Iran's nuclear facilities are attacked by either Israel or the United States. It doesn't mean that this will necessarily deter Israel or the United States from striking Iran if they believe that it is the right thing to do. Yes, we will have what I call the third Lebanon war plus. But at the very same time, I don't think that this in and of itself alone will deter Israel from doing it if it believes that this is the right thing to do. And there are also circumstances working in Israel's favor. The fact that Hezbollah is preoccupied in Syria, that they are under strong domestic constraints in Lebanon, they are under pressure. They don't want to be blamed for another war, igniting another war in Lebanon. They are under international pressure. There are many elements here which weaken Hezbollah. Again, this is not the reason why Israel would choose to do something in Iran. This is a whole different set of considerations that Israel will apply. But if in this set of considerations, Israelis or Americans will reach a conclusion that this is the right thing to do, I don't think that they will be deterred by this arsenal.
I think that's obviously exactly right. I mean, the deterrence has worked the other way, right? I mean, 7 years now of not a peep from Hezbollah. So I think, and that should be kept, by the way, in perspective when we're thinking about what might come in Syria. I mean, if Israel has not only deterred all of its neighboring states, but also the biggest quote-unquote non-state, although it is pretty much a state actor in Lebanon, Hezbollah, for 7 years, I think it will be capable of establishing such deterrence with whatever other scenario that might come up in Syria. But that aside, your second question about U.S. policy, no, I don't think it was. I don't think it was just the election issue. I mean, a lot of people tried to make that, and some of our allies believed that that's what it was. So there was the Saudis and the Turks both advertised on the eve of the re-election that, now there was an influential editor in one of the major Saudi papers that wrote on the night of the election, just in 24 hours now we're going to see a change in the Syria policy, yay. And they were very disappointed. But the thing is, ahead of it, we were going, the ambassador to Turkey, the U.S. ambassador to Turkey, was publicly telling the Turks, and unnamed U.S. officials were publicly telling the Saudi papers, do not think that there's going to be a change in the policy after the election. So ultimately, it's not just about that. It was about basically the basic driver of the Obama administration policy is we don't want to get involved. That's it. If we do anything, it's going to be a slippery slope towards military intervention, and we don't want that. We're not going to touch it. We're not going to do it. Anything that comes near it, anything that smells of it, no way. We're not going to arm. We're not going to send lethal assistance. We're not going to do anything that in any way could metastasize into a military intervention by the United States. Period.
Yeah, I'll close with 2 points. I tried to argue throughout this panel that Hezbollah is being transformed from anti-Israel to anti-Sunni, but this does not mean that Hezbollah is becoming friends with Israel. It's just to make sure it's actually on the contrary. What's changing is this.
We are relieved.
Hezbollah's fighting. And I'm not trying to undermine the power of the 70,000 or how many thousand missiles that they have, but yeah, but my thinking is that with the change in the style of Hezbollah, and with the changes in the region, I think Hezbollah will be moving from cross-border war to more of a clandestine war throughout the world and world capitals. I think Hezbollah will be going after Israeli or Jewish targets throughout the world, and we should expect to see more of the Bulgaria bogus bombing or the Cyprus Ford attempt and many of these things. I think this is where Hezbollah will be, focusing now. It's not as strong. Yeah, Hezbollah has a formidable militia. We all know that. But in terms of spy networks, they're not still as strong. So my expectation is that they will be working on this part. And if Israel decides to hit back like it used to do in the 60s and the 70s, then that would justify whatever Hezbollah want to do cross-border. This is in regards to Hezbollah and Israel. Now, regarding the U.S. policy on Syria, okay, granted the popular mood in the U.S. is not into foreign policy. We understand that after two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the majority is not interested in these things. But my take is that this administration is not doing up to where everyone would be even interested. So they're doing less than they could do, and not only that, they are even speaking less than they should do. And I've been in this town reporting for a decade now, and I remember during the previous administration we used to get background briefings at state once every month. Every 2 weeks, and there was this sort of communication all the time open, and with this administration it's just turned to nothing. It's hard to get any statements on foreign policy other than these readouts that mean everything and nothing at the same time. So it's a whole style, it's a whole mindset, and I think just like
well, there's leaks to the New York Times and David Ignatius.
But otherwise, I think the performance of Washington on most of the foreign policy, the Middle East and Syria included, is not as good as it could have and should have.
Well, thanks to Tony, thanks to Hussein, thanks to Michael, and thanks to you all. Keep in touch. We've got another conference coming up on Turkey on Friday as well, and many more down the road. Thanks very much.